Okay, chapter 10, launching the new ship of state. This is going to start out by talking about the United States as it was under the brand new Constitution. So let's get into it right away here. Okay, in 1790, what America looked like. So they're jumping ahead to 1790, and they tell you that the population was about 90% rural. Most of the people lived out in the country. There weren't that many big cities, as we talked about. All but 5% of the people lived east of the Appalachian Mountains. So on the East Coast, obviously. 5% of the people ventured out and went to the other side of the Appalachians. Vermont became the 14th state in 1791. First time that we had a new state come in. Many problems that had to be addressed that were left in the wake of the poor government that was the Articles of Confederation. First of all, you had to find a leader. The new Constitution, as you know, did provide for a president in the executive branch, so they had to elect a president, and obviously we know that's going to be George Washington, and we know that it was a unanimous choice as well. But they had to also pay back a large debt that they owed their own people. War bonds were sold, and people were holding on to these war bonds that were basically worthless because the federal government had no money to pay their own debt back. We also had debts to pay to other countries like France. We had to address problems with the British, the French, and the Spanish. As we've talked about before, there were issues and problems under the Articles of Confederation, but because there was no military, they could not be addressed. So let's talk about the new unanimously elected George Washington as president. In the previous chapter, we discussed his election was interesting in that the people weren't allowed to vote. The founding fathers knew exactly who they wanted to be president. They did not allow the people to vote, and he was unanimously selected in the Electoral College, and he's the only president in history to be unanimously selected in the Electoral College. He was commanded by strength of his character. He was a good leader. He had high morals, and people naturally followed him. And it's a lot of the same reasons why he was such a good general. As a general, he did not have a great military record, but he commanded people with his strength of character. And the other thing that he does is he isn't given enough credit for this, but he set the precedent for future presidents. How you look, how you act, what you're called, all those good things. He also set up a cabinet. The cabinet is not provided for in the Constitution. It doesn't say anything about having a Secretary of State or a Secretary of the Treasury. But Washington, I can imagine Washington saying when he becomes president, my gosh, this is a huge job. I need helpers. And his helpers were Thomas Jefferson. He chose as what he called his Department of State. And the Department of State is responsible for foreign countries, figuring out what's going on in other countries. And it was a great fit for Thomas Jefferson because he was well-traveled. He had lived for a time in France as an ambassador there, so he knew Europe. And Washington felt he was very smart. He was brilliant, writer of the Declaration of Independence, and he's given the job of being the first ever Secretary of State. The Department of War was created for obvious reasons to be prepared for war. In 1947, we changed it to the Department of Defense and restructured it. But at this point, they called it the Department of War. And Henry Knox was the first ever Secretary of War. If you remember, Henry Knox is the man responsible for bringing the guns from Ticonderoga and Crown Point over the mountains to Boston. So he had a good military mind. He was a bookseller. He was very learned in that way. He read a lot of books, and Washington respected his knowledge of military. The Secretary of Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, a well-known figure these days because of the play Hamilton. If you ever have a chance to see that, you got to go see it. He was a brilliant mind. He was in charge of Washington's finances during the Revolutionary War. So Washington knew he was very, very good with money. So New Yorker Alexander Hamilton was chosen as the first ever Secretary of Treasury. So Department of Treasury, obviously, you got to know, how much money you have and how to spend it. So Alexander Hamilton is that guy. And finally, the Attorney General of the United States, the first ever Attorney General, was a man by the name of Edmund Randolph. And Washington very much respected his knowledge of the law. As a lawyer, he fit perfectly for this job. So there you have it. The first ever cabinet consisted of these four gentlemen right here. Over the years, the cabinet has grown. I've got some extra information in here that I want you to know about the president's cabinet. The president's cabinet is under the executive branch, and the cabinet includes the vice president, it's the president plus the vice president, and then 15 executive departments that we have today. There's 15 secretaries, one's in charge of each one of the departments. And in order to get a secretary appointed, the president appoints, and then it must be confirmed by the Senate. And you must have today majority, which is 51 of the senators vote yes. This is usually just a formality. It happens when a president wants to pick his own cabinet. He should be able to pick his own cabinet, and only if there's obvious issues or problems with the candidate would the Senate reject a president's choice for his cabinet. A rule is that they cannot be a member of Congress or hold any other elected office. They would have to resign let's say a Senate seat or a House of Representatives seat to become, say, the Secretary of State. Cabinet appointments are for the duration of the administration only. And if a president is voted out, then they're out. It's a 4-year job, and under the best circumstance, an 8-year job. President could get rid of his cabinet secretaries at any time without the approval of the Senate. And, you've seen Trump do this quite a bit. They are expected to resign when the president takes office. So here's what it looks like today. A list of all our different 15 departments right there. The Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, trade, dealing with trade, defense, education, energy, health and human services, homeland security, housing and urban development, justice, labor, state, interior, treasury, transportation, and the Department of Veteran Affairs. That is a alphabetical list of the 15 departments. All of them are in line for the presidency in case something were to happen. I'll explain that in class. Remind me to explain that. The Judiciary Act of 1789. Shortly after Congress went into session, they had to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with the Supreme Court? The Constitution doesn't specify how many justices, and they came up with a plan to have 6 justices, 5 executive justices, and then a Chief Justice of the United States. There's a problem with that in that it's an even number, but they will eventually change that to what we have today, which is 9. And the first ever Chief Justice of the United States was appointed by George Washington, and it was John Jay, one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, who will play a pretty big role in history going forward here, as we'll discuss. Let's talk a little bit about Alexander Hamilton. I think Alexander Hamilton is one of the most underrated early figures in American history. Our system of government that we have today, with the strong central government and weaker states, is mostly the vision of Alexander Hamilton. You got to give George Washington some credit too, but this guy had a vision, and he pretty much saw it through until he was killed in a duel. But he oftentimes would be opposed by Thomas Jefferson. In a few minutes here, we'll be talking about political parties, the birth of political parties. Hamilton was a controversial person. Um, he was not very, I'd say, well liked by his political opponents. He could be brash. He could be bold. He was stubborn. It was his way or the highway. And if you disagreed with him, you were wrong in his eyes. So because of that personality that Alexander Hamilton had, he didn't endear himself to a lot of people. George Washington was one of the people that he did endear himself to. They were very close. So let's talk a little bit about his financial plan, which arguably is the most important thing that had to be addressed right after the new government was instituted. I mean, when you're in debt as a country, you got to get out of debt. You got to figure things out quickly. So money makes the world go round. Hamilton realized this, and he went to work in making the economic, standing of the United States better than it was before he got there. And he definitely did that. So first off, let's talk about the debt that the government owed. Boy, it was a debt that wasn't paid back to their own people. As I stated a few minutes ago, people were enticed to buy war bonds by their states. So Virginia, New York, they put ads out, right? They wanted people. They were pleading with people, please buy war bonds. It's a small investment. You give them money. Let's say you give them $1,000. Well, you get an IOU basically. It's a bond that says we owe you $1,000 plus interest, and it's not a huge amount of interest, but it's something. And more than anything, it was very patriotic for people to buy war bonds. Well, it's all good and fine until you can't pay those war bonds back. So after the war was over, people were trying to get their money. They were going to the government and say, look, I'm having hard times. I need my $1,000. And the government said, sorry, we don't have any money. Remember, the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't charge taxes. So it was a government that was reduced to begging and pleading and groveling, and they couldn't get enough money to pay these people back. So there's a lot of people out there in the United States that were holding war bonds that were basically worthless unless at some point the government decides that they're going to pay these war bonds back. But after years, I mean, the war ended in 1781, right? The treaty was 1783, but the war essentially ended in 81. And here we are talking about, 10 years later, 10 years later, and people still aren't being paid back. Well, that's a long time. And people were beginning to lose faith in the government, and they didn't think they were ever going to get paid back. Some people even went so far as to sell them to speculators. Speculators were people that would go around and they would ask anybody, hey, we buy war bonds, but they'd buy them at a cut price. So if someone had $1,000 war bond, they may buy it for $100. But the person who, might be down and out and need that $100, yeah, they should have got more, but they didn't have any faith that the government was ever going to pay this back. So they would sell it at a cheap price, and speculators would just go and gamble. Right? They would try to accumulate as many war bonds as they could in hopes that someday the government their word would be good, and they would pay this back at par, which meant with interest. And it was Alexander Hamilton who said, we have to do this. We have to pay this back. So when he became president, he proposed a bill, and it was called the Assumption Plan. And the Assumption Plan it said that the federal government would assume, which also means to take over, states' debts. All states who had a debt, the federal government said, we'll pay it for you. States were buying in immediately, going, wow, that's good. It was also a way for Hamilton to, yes, make sure that the government's credit was good, but also to get buy-in from the states. When the federal government comes and says, don't worry about your debt, the federal government will take your debt for you, then these states were going, great. Altogether, if you added up the debt of all 13 states, it came to $54 million. That's nothing in today's terms, but back then, $54 million was a tremendous amount of money. And all these states just handed over their debt. And the federal government said, we're going to pay this back at par with interest. And even if you're a speculator and you've accumulated 15 of these, we're paying back all 15 of them. So speculators were ecstatic, and they're going to become some of the richest people in the colonies because the federal government's going to make them that way. So you're getting buy-in from the states. One, you're getting buy-in for the brand new rich people in the colonies or the states because they're getting paid by the government. That was all part of Hamilton's plan. Hey, get buy-in for this. And if rich people buy in, then maybe they'll open up factories. Alexander Hamilton wanted the Industrial Revolution to come to America. He was a businessman. He wanted factories, and he thought maybe these people would be the ones that open them up. And sure enough, some of them did. Here's the problem, though, is it's very controversial to a state like Virginia. Virginia had already paid their debt off. Remember, we're talking about Virginia being the richest in the colonies. They'd already paid their debt back. And Virginia's like, why in the heck would we want to pay someone other states' debts back when we already paid ours? So Virginia said, we're not voting for your little assumption plan in the House of Representatives. Because remember, all bills dealing with money, finances, originate in the House of Representatives. The biggest state at the time was Virginia. Therefore, Virginia had more representatives than any of the other states, kind of like California does today. So that's what Virginia said, we're not voting for your little plan. And Hamilton was frustrated, and Hamilton went to talk to Jefferson. These two would grow to hate each other, but at this time, the hate's not there yet. They hammer out a deal, and Alexander Hamilton tells Thomas Jefferson, look, if you convince your congressman to vote yes on the assumption plan, we will put the brand new Capitol that we're going to build in your backyard at the banks of the Potomac River. And Jefferson went, wow, the new Capitol right by Virginia? Awesome, we'll do it. So they shook hands, they made an agreement, and they started construction of Washington, D.C. along the banks of the Potomac River. There was talk that it would be at New York or Philadelphia, which makes sense. Big port cities. Why in the heck would you build the Capitol on the Potomac River? Would you have New York or something, you could do it. And this is why. The Capitol is where the Capitol is. So once they did that, the assumption plan was passed. The federal government took over the $54 million. They paid the speculators over time, and Hamilton came out smelling like a rose because he looks good in the eyes of the state. He looks good in the eyes of the speculators, and things were trending in his way. Pierre L'Enfant, here is the guy who was given the job of planning Washington, D.C. Pierre L'Enfant was the architect of D.C. He ends up getting fired at some point because he was very, very meticulous and took his time, and they didn't want him to take his time. But he's now known as a very well-respected man. In Washington, D.C., you see L'Enfant. There's a train station, subway station named after him. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery up above where Kennedy's eternal flame is at the very top. It's a beautiful view of all of Washington, D.C. So Pierre L'Enfant is the one who sketched these blueprints of Washington, D.C. And some of the, you can see some of the buildings in D.C. This is the view from L'Enfant's tomb up on, I don't know if this is exactly taken from that. This is what you see. It's probably close to where Pierre L'Enfant was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. I don't think this was taken from the cemetery, but it would be even higher than this. So in the foreground here is the Lincoln Memorial. You have the Washington Memorial right there, and the Capitol building all in a line. So this is the World War II monument, the latest one, the newest of the monuments. There's the White House, and there's the Capitol building right there, and the Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial. So just put some things out there for you to see. This is the marshlands in front of the Lincoln Memorial before, when they were building it. Right now, that's where that area right there is the reflecting pool. And there's a Washington, there's a reflecting pool right there. So you're looking at, like, if you were at the steps, this picture is probably taken in front of the Lincoln Memorial. So the Lincoln Memorial right there, and then here would, in the front here, this area right here would be the reflecting pond, and then on the other side would be the Washington Monument that was built later on. Okay, so another part of Hamilton's plan was custom duties and excise taxes, the dreaded T word, two T words, tariff and tax, excise tax. Boy, people did not want to hear this, but they're coming to the conclusion that it's necessary. And it's not oftentimes an easy thing to sell for politicians that you need to increase taxes, but that's exactly what's going on at this time. They came to the conclusion this idea that there should be no taxes isn't going to work. So the federal government's going to institute two things. One would be a tariff, which is a tax on imports. Tariffs are to protect infant industries in the United States. And Hamilton wanted these industries to come to the United States, and then he wanted to protect them so that people wouldn't buy foreign products. Remind me in class to talk about what a tariff is. An excise tax is like a sales tax on goods within the United States that people would be paying. And the money would go to the government, and then the government would use that money to pay off the $54 million in debt from the Assumption Plan. So that was the overall plan there. And then a safe place to put money also became really important. So Hamilton proposed what's called the National Bank. Europe, in England had a national bank. It would be a private institution that would be owned partially by the public, but mostly by the government. And it was a safe place for the government to put its money. Now that the government was going to be taking in all this money in taxes, where do you put that money? Simple question. Do you put it in state banks and you never really know how much money it is? Or do you put it in one central location? Seemed to be a pretty good idea. Well, there's those who liked it and there are those who didn't like it. You're talking about this whole federal government getting stronger thing, and then some of the states are saying, no, the states should be stronger. So you're starting that argument. So yeah, the national bank was proposed, and then Jefferson, who grows to really very much dislike Hamilton. These guys really didn't like each other very much. Hamilton says, we must have a national bank. Jefferson says, we can't have a national bank. It's not stated in the Constitution. Jefferson was a strict interpreter of the Constitution. If it wasn't in the Constitution, you can't do it. Basically, he says what was not permitted by the document was forbidden. He said a bank should be state controlled because the Constitution doesn't say anything about it. He says the Constitution should be interpreted literally and strictly. On the flip side, you had Hamilton who says, wait, are you kidding me? This is a vague document. It doesn't get into specifics. This document needs to be good in 1789 and also in 2020. He says what was not forbidden in the Constitution should be permitted. And he says that he evokes what's called the elastic clause. The elastic clause in the Constitution states that Congress should be able to do that which is necessary and proper to rule the country. And Hamilton says a bank is necessary and proper. So you should be able to do it. He loosely interprets that document. So you could see Jefferson saying, if we loosely interpret it, it's going to turn into a dictatorship. Hamilton saying, how could you just go just by what's in the Constitution? That might hold us back as a country. So these two men were at odds with each other. Well, at the end of the day, Hamilton's going to get what he wants. Washington supported it. He signed a bill into law. And in 1791, the first ever national bank was opened up in Philadelphia. And there it is right there with a 20-year charter. A charter is permission to operate, and they have permission to operate for 20 years. They're going to have branches in each of the states eventually. But this process of starting the national bank happened, and it was successful, and Jefferson was not a happy man about that. Okay, let's talk briefly here about the first ever challenge to the new government. You knew that the first time that the new government was challenged that there might be a little bit of an overshow of force, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. They didn't want the new government to be people to perceive that the new government's weak in any way. Washington was going to flex his muscles, and he did. The first challenge to the new government came in Pennsylvania. The farmers out in Pennsylvania were really upset about Hamilton's excise tax because it was an excise tax on whiskey, is what it was, grain, which would increase the price of whiskey and people wouldn't buy it. Pennsylvania farmers were turning their grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport east rather than big old bales of grain. They would just make whiskey out of it, and it sold really well. Well, then Hamilton's excise tax increased the price of whiskey, and the farmers weren't going to sell as much, and they weren't happy. So they said, we're not happy, we're going to take up arms. So Washington heard about it and said, not on my watch, you know. An army of 13,000 that were personally addressed by George Washington, and George Washington said, go get them. And 13,000 went into Pennsylvania. As soon as the farmers saw that, they put down any weapons or anything, and they said, just kidding, we're not going to do that. So it was an overshow of force by Washington. He did it on purpose. Some will say that it was a killing a gnat with a sledgehammer. Killing a gnat with a sledgehammer, right? An overshow of force to prove that the new government is not going to put up with anything like the old government did. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about here is this emergence of political parties. These two men, Jefferson and Hamilton, their dislike for each other, they were completely opposite in their beliefs, one being liberal, one being conservative, but they pick sides. People pick sides. Some supported Jefferson, some supported Hamilton, and this personal rivalry between these two men evolved into political parties. The founding fathers didn't envision political parties coming to the United States like they were in England because they were divisive. You're seeing it right now, right? I just was watching the Senate confirmations of the justice from the Supreme Court, and it's Democrat versus Republican, and it's very divisive right now. But all in all, political parties have been good for this country. So anyways, in these two men, their rivalry evolved into two political parties. And there's a little bit of a funny meme right there. Political parties, you got your red Solo cups and your founding fathers in sunglasses, and they don't even, didn't envision political parties. This was their version of a political party. They got the boom box there. Just a little funny. Okay, so let's talk about the two political parties. You got the Democrat-Republican Party led by Thomas Jefferson. They were called Democrat-Republican Party. James Madison also was a follower of Jefferson. And then you had the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams were followers of the Federalist Party. Now, where would you find them? The Federalists, you'd find them on the East Coast, in the North, in those places, in Boston and New York. Wherever there was money, Federalist. The Democrat Republicans, you find them where you had common men, farming communities, South, out West, they were Democrat Republicans. Let's talk about their beliefs. When it comes to who should rule, Democrat Republicans believe that the common man should rule. Federalists believe rich people should rule. They're the most educated, and they have the most to gain or lose, so they should be ruling. When it comes for what that structure of the national government, the Democrat Republicans believe in a weak national government and stronger states. On the flip side, the Federalists believed in a strong national government and weaker states. The Democrat Republicans believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution, whereas the Federalists and Hamilton believed in the elastic clause and loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Democrat Republicans were all about states' rights. The Federalists were all about strong federal government. The Democrat Republicans wanted to help farmers, and the Federalists wanted the Industrial Revolution, factories to come to America. Democrat Republicans hated the idea. Jefferson hated the idea of the Industrial Revolution coming to America because he lived in France where there was a strong Industrial Revolution and there are slums everywhere and it wasn't good. And he says, I never want this to come to America. Whereas Hamilton says that's where the money is. Jefferson hated tariffs. and the Federalists said we have to have tariffs to protect these new infant industries. So, and then the Democrat Republicans wanted no national bank. The Federalists wanted a national bank. The Democrat Republicans tended to support the French because Thomas Jefferson used to live there. And then the Federalists tended to really like the British because they could do business with them and make money off of them. So these are the two political parties. If you want to try to figure out which is which in today's world, the Democrat Republicans would be the forerunners of the Democrat Party. The Federalists would be the forerunners of the Republican parties.